Okay, it seems like we have a good group of people already on here. Thanks to everybody who has joined us today. My name is Gabriela Bocio Santos. I'm the Engagement Manager with BU Sustainability. I just want to let everybody know that this session is being recorded and the recording will be made available after the fact with captions added to the video. So that's just to let everyone know that we're currently being recorded. If you don't feel comfortable with that, then that's something that you should consider, whether to stay or to say anything during this time. Thank you all for joining our event, Exploring Environmental Justice, How Boston Area Leaders Are Advancing Healthy, Equitable Communities. We have some really fantastic guests today who will be discussing why the environmental justice movement is important to them, organizing efforts and campaigns past and present, and their own journeys. We are going to end this event by offering ways in which the audience can support their work. This session, like I said, is going to be recorded, and the recording will be made available in the coming weeks with caption. I want to ask that everyone keep their microphone and their video off during this panel so that we can better hear our panelists. If you do have questions that arise as the panelists are sharing their information, you can share those questions through the chat and you can send them directly to Neha Chinwala, who is going to be one of our moderators for the Q&A panel, and she's just waving there. We are going to try to get to as many as those questions as we can during our Q&A. Our moderators today are going to be Sam Hall and Neha Chinwala, both of whom are students at BU, and they're going to be guiding our conversation. So thank you, Sam. Thank you, Neha. Before I hand it off to Sam, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that environmental justice has historically not been a topic that universities and environmental or sustainability focused groups have done a great job at addressing. In fact, environmental or sustainability groups have at times stood in direct opposition to or in conflict with environmental justice organizations. And this is something that needs to change because there is no sustainable future if it isn't also just. The systems that profit from the unfettered and unsustainable misuse of our natural resources are the same systems that profit from the disenfranchisement and oppression of Black, Brown, Indigenous, low-income, queer people, and communities. Health, racism, classism, poverty, climate change, all of these are interrelated topics, and the way that we address them needs to be intersectional as well. For those of you who may not be familiar with the term, environmental racism refers to the fact that some communities in the United States, particularly Black communities, bear a disproportionate impact of the environmental hazards while enjoying fewer or none of the environmental benefits. There are decades of research and history on this. There's people who are really, really knowledgeable about this, and there's so much more than I can do justice to in just a few minutes. We at BU Sustainability are not experts on environmental justice, and that's why we have invited practitioners with many years of on-the-ground experience on these issues to talk about this. And I want to thank them again for their time and for joining us here. I want to leave you with one more parting thought. Sustainability isn't just about being green, loving nature, preserving wild spaces, endangered species. It isn't just about turning off lights. To me, sustainability is about people. It's about the future that we want to build together and the kind of world that we want to live in. And if we're reimagining and rebuilding our communities, justice and equity need to be a part of that equation for all of our sakes. We can't be islands of sustainability. It doesn't work that way. We're going to all sink or rise together. So now I'm going to hand it over to Sam, who is going to introduce herself as well as our panelists.
Thank you, Gabriela, for that great introduction. Yes, my name is Sam Hall, and I am on the leadership team for the Boston University Medical Campus Climate Action Group. I'm currently pursuing my Master's of Public Health and Environmental Health and Infectious Disease here at BU. I have the pleasure of introducing our panelists, and then we'll jump into some questions, and I will then hand it off to Neha Chinwala, who will facilitate questions received from the audience. As mentioned, please send your questions to the chat, and we will be happy to address them later in this session. To begin, we are so excited to be joined by Hajar Logan today. Hajar has most recently been working at Alternatives for Community and Environment, or ACE, as the Climate and Transit-Oriented Development Director. She has recently left ACE to continue her graduate work at Tufts, as well as in her private consulting practice. In her time at ACE and beforehand, Hajar has worked towards climate and environmental justice through real estate development, civic design, and housing justice. She is skilled at training organizers and other leaders for the purpose of building greater public, economic, and political security. Next, we are joined by Kalila Barnett, who serves as the Climate Resilience Officer at the Barr Foundation. The Barr Foundation works to secure funding and create grant proposals for community programs surrounding the arts and creative sectors, climate health, and education. Before joining Barr, Kalila served as the Executive Director at ACE and has spent over a decade working as an organizer in affordable housing, land development, and environmental justice. She has a master's in public policy from Tufts. We are also grateful to be joined by Belen Power, who currently works as the Associate Executive Director at Green Roots in Chelsea. She has extensive experience in the organizing field with immigrant workers, day laborers, and public housing tenants. She has also earned a master's in public policy from Tufts and a certificate in nonprofit management and leadership at BU. While the COVID-19 pandemic has hit Chelsea quite hard, Green Roots is doing strong community work surrounding the COVID response. We're excited to hear about Belen's experiences, both here at Green Roots and elsewhere. Now I'm going to hand it off to each of our panelists, and I invite them to please add anything to those introductions, maybe more detail into your current positions and touching on what your organizations do. Hajar, if you'd like to start us off.
Hi, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I hope everybody can hear me well. I have fans on in the background, so if it's hard to hear me, I'll just turn them off. Thank you. What really excites me about my work and about the work that ACE was doing, or ACE is doing around climate and environmental justice and around transit-oriented development justice and housing is that we bridge the gap between, and we look at the intersections between the siloed work that is often spaced out around social justice issues, and we look for a systemic racism and a structural equity lens, and we use that to bridge gaps in racial justice issues and make sure that when we're dealing with environmental justice and climate justice, we are dealing with them in a way that really starts to deal with systemic racism in our communities. So we often have a public health focus when we deal with climate and environmental justice, which makes us unique. This work is exciting to me because I think that my life work purpose, and I guess one of the things I'm most proud of is that we start to work on systemic racism collectively with everyone involved, all hands on deck, from a guided, of course, from the perspectives of those most impacted, but then also adding perspectives of experts and industry experts as well as academic experts to build policy that really is transformative and impactful. So I'm really glad to be here and glad to be on a panel with such esteemed people. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Kalila?
Yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity to participate in the conversation tonight. I'm very happy to be on with Belen and Hajar, who are good folks, good friends in this work. Yeah, you know, as my bio said, I come out of community organizing, doing community-based work, and transitioned into my role at the Barr Foundation 2 years ago this summer. The climate program at Barr has 3 focus areas: climate resilience, which I oversee, and we'll get to talk a little bit more about that work tonight. We also fund work around mobility and clean energy. And so for us, you know, those are kind of 3 areas that really are important to come together, both in terms of thinking about how do we reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but also how do we adapt to current and future climate impacts? And also how do we do that in a way that centers racial equity and that centers justice for the communities that have been most burdened and most negatively impacted by the fossil fuel economy. So excited to talk with you all tonight about the role that philanthropy plays in supporting movement building and hopefully towards a more just future.
Thank you so much, Kalila. And Belen.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. And like Kalila said, it's good to be with all of you today. Yeah, I was born and raised in Nicaragua, came to the US about 15 years ago, and have been working with immigrant communities since then. Like my bio says, I got started with immigrant workers, day laborers, and workers' rights organizing, and later transitioned to environmental justice. And so that's really my passion, is community organizing and the intersection of all of these issues of housing, of transit, of environment, of immigrants' rights and workers' rights. So that's where I come from. Green Roots is an environmental justice organization that's working in Chelsea and East Boston on both sides of the Chelsea Creek. And our focus is really base building. We are resident led. And so a lot of our projects and campaigns come from the grassroots and from the most important issues that our residents are facing. And that includes food justice, transit, waterfront access, land use and displacement, among other things like public health. And we've seen how some of those have impacted the impact of COVID-19 and the pandemic. You know, we feel like we've been ringing the alarms on public health and on environmental racism for decades. And while we never expected COVID-19 to happen, we knew that the crisis, whatever crisis it was, that the impact would be exactly what happened. That the folks that are the most vulnerable, the frontline communities, would be hit worst, they would be hit first, and that they would have the hardest time bouncing back. And that's exactly what's happening. And so I'm excited to talk about the work that we do and where we're going moving forward. Thanks for having me.
Yes, thanks so much. And we are definitely interested in hearing about the impact COVID has had and the response happening around Boston. So thank you. So as we've seen, environmental justice has a lot of parts and is obviously intersectional work, particularly overlaid with the goal of creating health equity. And I'm curious if you could speak on what environmental justice means to you personally, not just within Boston, within organizations, but also kind of with a global mindset. So whoever would like to take that question first. Or I can call on someone also. Kalila, would you like to start?
Sure. Yeah, what does environmental justice mean for me? I mean, in a lot of ways, I feel like my kind of orientation to social movement work is really through an environmental justice lens. And, you know, ACE was the first organization where it encountered the term environmental justice and was, you know, introduced to the movement. And part of what really resonates with me is the principles, obviously, of an environmental justice, but particularly those that speak to self-determination of communities. And I think, you know, all of us on this panel and probably other folks on this Zoom call have numerous stories about the ways in which communities have been planned for, planned over, planned under. And, you know, environmental justice says, actually, you know, we should get to decide what is the future of our communities. And for me, that's just a really important, a really important principle and value in any kind of organizing and advocacy process, is that those who are most impacted not only have a seat at the table, but have decision-making power about their future.
Thank you. If anyone else would like to answer, or we can move on to the next question.
I can go next. I think I agree with Kalila with the principles around self-determination. When we think about Chelsea and East Boston, of folks having the power to decide what happens in their community and what happens to how do they have access to the natural resources, and how do we take sovereignty over those. I think the other piece that really stands to me around environmental justice is having the right to live a healthy life and the right to live a long, healthy life with your family and with your community, which is something that we've seen has been totally uncovered and exacerbated by COVID-19, that Black and Brown communities have not had that luxury of living healthy lives. And that shouldn't be a luxury. And so when we think about what has happened across the country, not just in Massachusetts, in environmental justice communities, is that folks have been left behind. And it's precisely those folks that like Kalila said, don't not only be at the table, but have decision-making power and sovereignty over their lives and over their health.
So I'll speak to that question as well. I think, like, so what that looks like on the ground, and I'll speak to it from that perspective, is sometimes the issues that you know come up in climate justice movements and environmental justice movements don't have a on-the-ground lens and don't have a perspective and or approach that is grounded in communities of color. And so we have to, as advocates and organizers in communities of color, we have to be listening first. And what that looks like is not just, for instance, it's just sat on the community choice energy table and has helped to form community choice energy ordinances, etc. But we can't do community choice energy, and we can't do work with the DPU from the perspective only renewable energy when our community is suffering from displacement and suffering from predatory utility involvement, where because utility energy and utility energy and energy in general is so blind, like you can't differentiate between one energy comes from another. The only way to sell energy is to sell it on price. And so predatory utility companies came in our communities, they came in low-income communities and disproportionate sold in predatory contracts, think variable rate mortgage, that type of predatory contracts with balloon payments and all in our community for years. And if you talk to people in our community about that, that's one of the utility justice issues and makes a difference. Being able to sell new renewable energy choices doesn't happen until address public predatory utility issues. And so this is one example of what it means to be grounded in community voice and to be guided by community voice. There are so many other things that come up, right? Just thinking about that in terms of like COVID and a COVID response, right? So when when your community is then moved to another crisis point, maybe issues and the concerns and the movement moves differently. And that's a part of what it means to be grounded in implementing and being guided by the voices that are most impactful.
Absolutely. Thank you. Yes, not only giving value to each human life, but listening. Absolutely. So I think we've kind of edged around this question, but would you all mind sharing a campaign that you're currently working on? And let's go ahead and get started with Maria Belen.
Sure. So we have been fighting against an Eversource substation on the banks of the Chelsea Creek for more than a couple years now. Just to talk very briefly, because I could talk for hours about this, just very briefly, Eversource is proposing a substation on the banks of the Chelsea Creek next to 8 million gallons of jet fuel and adjacent to a heavily utilized playground in East Boston on a flood zone, a parcel of land that not only is projected to flood, but has flooded several times in the past. And if that wasn't terrible enough, the proposal was pre-approved through a process that completely excluded residents. We mobilized residents. We went to the hearing when it was pre-approved. It was about 40 residents that live around there and in surrounding communities. And we requested interpretation ahead of time. and interpretation was only provided for the board, the Energy Facility Siting Board, to understand from Spanish to English. But for 4 hours that residents sat there, they did not understand what was happening and the projects that were really going to go in their backyard and in the very community that they live in. So for us, when we talk about, Hajar was mentioning utility justice, this is the kinds of processes that should not be not only unacceptable, but completely illegal, to have a process that approves such a dangerous infrastructure, which is not only poor planning and dangerous, but a process that has intentionally excluded folks who don't have a political voice. We know that this would not happen in communities that are white and wealthy, because they have political voice and they have political power to ensure that they have a voice. And that's what we mean when we think and when we talk about having a voice and sovereignty over your own community and your own resources. So we've mobilized, we've testified, we've done everything in the organizer's playbook, and we will continue to do so until we stop the substation from being built. Right up until COVID hit and everything, all public meetings were shut down, the Energy Facility Siting Board was going to continue with a public meeting on March 11th. The same day the governor had called for all meetings to be canceled, but they were going to go ahead. And so we really raised the alarm and said, you can't have people choose between participating in a process or choosing over public health and getting infected with COVID. In the end, the meeting was canceled. It was postponed, but we're still engaged in the legal and official processes, as well as ensuring that the residents that are most impacted are part of the process.
Thank you. Maybe Hajar?
Stuff off of mute. In terms of a campaign, one of the things that we worked on when we started at ACE recently is building standards, and we worked on building standards as a conjunction between development and displacement, and trying to incorporate our community in a conversation around how we could achieve long-term public health. And so in including our community in that task, we address things like air pollution, and how do we mitigate the impacts of air pollution instead of trying to just reduce it. We already have campaigns working on transportation and public transit as well as design, as you saw in my bio. But what we would do with building standards is how do we create a systemic and long-term answer to our community's concerns around impacts of what has become intergenerational respiratory illnesses. And so instead of just working on building standards with our Justice allies in areas around carbon dioxide, we focused on the impacts that our communities were concerned with, and those impacted directly to public health, respiratory illnesses, and cardiovascular diseases that we witness in our communities, witness in our elders, and in our children every day. And those illnesses relate to asthma, bronchitis. Many of our elders have stroke, have heart disease, and so these are impacts that happen every day in our communities. And one way that we can address those impacts is that we can start to get buildings that are designed affordably, but also designed so that the air inside, the air quality is ventilated, and so that the buildings are certified passive house design. And those are one of the aims. In working on this, we've been able to galvanize housing justice advocates and galvanize advocates and residents in low-income communities across Roxbury, Dorchester, and Mattapan, and across Chinatown and Alston, Brighton, the communities most impacted crisis building standards and the heavy amounts of air pollution and heat island impacts to build a solution for building performance standards that make a real difference. And so I'm obviously passionate about that work and also proud of it and looking forward to the results.
Yes, absolutely. And especially for the housing issues, these illnesses are preventable. So this work is obviously so important. Thank you all. And Kalila, if you could speak on a current project.
Yeah, so unfortunately, I'm not doing campaigns anymore, being in philanthropy. I mean, you know, first and foremost, our role is to support our grantees. And, you know, we're proud to have Green Roots and ACE counted in those numbers. But I think one of the things that, you know, is of particular importance to this moment that we're working on is really as an entire climate program, trying to think about what are our opportunities to better center racial equity in our work. And, you know, I encourage everyone who, you know, if you're for the first time kind of learning about the environmental justice movement or, you know, or newer to it, to really kind of understand and learn about the history behind it and the reasons why such a movement was necessary, largely because of the environmental racism that was happening sort of, you know, writ large, kind of sponsored by the government and promoted by the government, but also the kind of willful ignoring of those traumas and those harms by mainstream white-led environmental organizations. And, you know, there have been a couple of stories about the Sierra Club founder and a couple of other, you know, large mainstream stories about the history of the ways in which xenophobia and racism has really been embedded into the mainstream environmental movement for since its founding. And so, you know, kind of fast forward to today, we still see a huge discrepancy in terms of the amount of funding that's given to environmental justice organizations, those that are led by and grounded in communities of color versus mainstream white organizations. And so as a funder, we have to, you know, reflect on the ways that we have been complicit in furthering that disparity and think about what are our opportunities to really support our environmental justice partners differently and better, and also to really figure out how do we infuse racial equity across the climate movement, because we really see that as central to achieving our climate goals. There is not, you know, a singular focus on reducing greenhouse gas emissions is not going to get us the kind of world that we want to see. And we have to, you know, have an intersectional approach to this work, because that is really what is required to dismantle the systems that are keeping us down. And so we're, you know, working as a climate team to understand, you know, what are our grantees, what kind of support do our grantees need in this road around racial equity? Is it training? Is it coaching? And how can we, as an important funder in the region, really galvanize those conversations?
Thank you so much. Yes. I'm going to open this up to all three panelists. So if you are inclined to answer this question, you can give me a little sign. But do you have any thoughts on how higher education institutions like BU contribute negatively to the problem of environmental racism? And any thoughts on how can they instead contribute positively to the EJ movement, especially in the Boston area?
Yeah, I can speak about that. I can think of amazing examples of partnerships with universities, in particular with BU School of Public Health. I think there are some key components to having a genuine, long-lasting relationship where it's not just coming into a community and pulling the data that fits your study to prove some theory that you've already come up with. So I think there are ways that we have seen and we have experienced where relationships are developed and maintained to fit also the needs of the communities and the folks on the ground, where it is an iterative process. It is a long-term relationship, and it is about building trust with the folks on the ground. We have also had great experiences with participatory action research, where our folks, our members, not only staff of Green Roots and our organizers, but our residents are engaged in the development of the very, very particular research questions, where we're shaping the research from the very beginning all the way to the very end. We're not just brought in when it's necessary or convenient, but we've really taken into consideration what would we like to see, what do we need on the ground. So I think those are some key components to having a positive relationship with academic institutions.
Thank you so much. Yes. Do the other panelists have anything to add on that question, or we're good to move on?
I guess the only other thing, and maybe I just missed this in what you said, Maria Belen, but I also think, you know, I have seen opportunities where there have been joint funding between academic institutions and community organizations. And so I feel like oftentimes the dynamic is that academic institutions want to extract, you know, what are stories, want to extract, you know, knowledge and information for their own, you know, individual or departmental resource. But so I guess, you know, really shifting how you think about communities, not as objects, but as, you know, as other entities that are trying to do good in the world and made up of human beings. And so having that kind of approach. And, you know, one of the things that's really important to small grassroots organizations is having the resources that they need to continue. And so how can you use your power and influence as an institution to make sure that groups continue to get the money that they need to do their work?
Absolutely. All right, well, this will be our last question for this part of the session, and then we'll move on to taking some audience questions. But do you have any advice for how folks in the audience can get involved in or support your organization? Hajar, would you like to start that one?
Sure. So no job too big or too small. It's an all hands on deck experience. So some of the ways that I can support is that we're doing some like environmental justice mapping, and we're doing some research. We're culling information around COVID hacks. So that's one way. And another way is that you could do some phone canvassing for events. Like for instance, Ibram Bendy, I think is his name, had an anti-racist conference. It was a 3-day conference. It's amazing conference. And so, like getting the word out to people, talking to people around what are the impacts in their community that they're prioritizing, because the COVID issue is fluid, and those are kinds of things that you could do that, you know, are just an afternoon or so. It would be very helpful, and they lead to big, better, wonderful things. So those are ways that you could get engaged today.
Can I add just one thing?
Please.
Thank you, Hajar and Sam. I think one important thing is to get in touch with the organizations that are in your community, and to get in touch with organizations that are led by Black and brown folks in your own community. I think a lot of times, you know, I'm from Nicaragua. I was born and raised there. And a lot of times we saw US citizens come to Nicaragua and wanting to help Nicaragua and wanting to really care about what's happening, but they had not seen the struggles and the poverty and the inequities in their own city. And now I live in Boston, and I live in the Boston area. I live in Chelsea, and I see what's happening in Boston. That it's a barrier for folks to see what is happening so close to where they live. You know, Chelsea the Chelsea Creek has 100% of the jet fuel for Logan Airport, 70 to 80% of the region's home heating fuel. We store the salt for 350 communities for the winter. We have one of the largest produce distribution centers in the country, contributing to our poor air quality. You know, the rest of our waterfront is covered with airport-related parking, the impacts from the airport. So all I'm saying is that I think folks need to look closely to where they live, where they get those benefits, and try to get in touch with the organizations that are doing the work on the ground. And if that's Green Roots and ACE, then there are ways to develop long-lasting relationships where you can support and be an ally to our campaigns.
Absolutely. And do you have any, specifically any advice on how people can find environmental justice organizations that are in their community?
I mean, I don't know, you gotta do some research. I don't know. I mean, there are, and you know, in Massachusetts, there are many organizations that do multi-issue organizing. There are some great friends and allies that do base building around a variety of issues. I would say that the two organizations in Massachusetts that focus on environmental justice are ACE and Green Roots.
Wonderful. And we're so lucky to have all three of you here today.
I would say one coalition that both ACE and Green Roots are part of is the Green Justice Coalition, and some of those groups, as Maria Belen mentioned, are multi-issue, but they span a few different geographies and mostly in the eastern part of the state, so that could be a place for folks to look as well.
Wonderful. And that link is now in our chat, so feel free to click on that, everyone. Great. Okay. Well, thank you all so much, and we will continue the conversation as I hand this off to Neha to handle the audience questions.
Thanks so much, Sam. Hi, everyone. My name is Neha Chinwala, and I'm the Director of Environmental Affairs for BU Student Government and a junior studying Earth and Environmental Science at BU. So thank you to everyone who has added their questions in the chat already. If you still have some, you can continue to add them, and we'll get to them if we can. But to start off, someone asked, what is one place or example of climate change or environmental degradation disproportionately impacting marginalized communities that I can share with others who may not be aware of environmental racism or may not have recognized it? So basically, like, what's an example that I could share with someone who's not familiar with this topic?
Okay, so I'm going to give you one, and I'm trying to be really concise. So there is a systemic cause and effect that happens when you live in a community that has a large amount of vehicle traffic. And that systemic cause and effect is that your body is more susceptible to respiratory illness and to cardiovascular illness. And so in communities that have a lot of highways and or major roads that where lots of vehicles travel, there is a larger amount of people with asthma and with hypertension and who get strokes when they get older. Incidentally, that correlates directly with COVID because it's a respiratory disease.
Thank you for that example, Hajar. Does anyone else have anything they want to share? Or we can move on to another question.
I mean, I would just encourage, sorry.
No, go for it, Kalila.
I think, you know, definitely continuing to do some research. I think it's helpful to give examples of that are also specific to whatever the locality is. So, you know, for example, you know, what Hajar was mentioning, you know, communities living close to highways, a lot of that happened because of urban renewal, which was a national effort. And so there are examples of the ways in which urban renewal policies have compromised the health of environmental justice communities. So really, you could pick any major city in this country and figure out some stories from there. and really just kind of follow along from there and think about, you know, the housing strands that are related to that, the transportation strands that are related to that. So that's what I would say.
And you will see it in your own backyard in Roxbury and Dorchester.
Maria Belen, do you want to add what you were trying to say before?
I'll be super brief. I was just going to say COVID is a very great and awful example of, you know, communities that have poor air quality. You know, the science is still out, or, you know, there's a lot of studies going on around COVID just because it's such a new pandemic. But I mean, but the impacts that COVID has had in communities that have industrial and environmental burdens, communities that are non-English speaking, that are Black and Brown, that have suffered the impacts of environmental injustice. I mean, we've seen how COVID has impacted environmental justice communities across the country disproportionately. So I think that's a very clear and relevant example.
Yes, thank you so much.
I said Roxbury, Chester, but I should have added Chelsea and Chinatown, and just imagine wherever you see the highways that have been there a good long time, those issues exist.
Thank you. So the next question is specifically for Kalila, and the audience member was asking how your perspective has changed now that you are on the funding side.
Tough questions. I would say that in a lot of ways, it hasn't changed that much, in that, you know, part of what I wanted to do in this role is to be able to carry some of the values and principles that I learned through my time at ACE and, you know, in relationship to other social movement organizations into philanthropy. And so I think in terms of what I'm attempting to do with my grant making, you know, I hope that it's reflective of those values and principles. And I hope that if it's not, my friends will tell me to get in line. But I think, you know, part of the dynamic has shifted though is, you know, even though I'm not a final decision maker on grants that go out, I have a huge amount of influence in cultivating new grantees, in, you know, bringing organizations in front of the Barr Foundation and saying, hey, you should think more about the work that they're doing. And so there's definitely, you know, a power dynamic there that's very present in, you know, all of my conversations. And so I, you know, try to think about how can I incorporate grant making practices that, you know, do their best to kind of level the playing field. While also at the same time, you know, understanding that philanthropy as an institution is extremely flawed, and but what are the ways in which, you know, through my portfolio I can help to you know, to strengthen social movements and build towards systemic change. So I feel like the power dynamic thing is probably sort of one of the biggest shifts that I've noticed during my time at Barr.
Thank you so much. You have a very interesting perspective based on like all the different things that you've done. So thank you for sharing. The next question is from an audience member who was asking, how do you incorporate Indigenous sovereignty and Indigenous rights into environmental justice work?
I mean, I think that's a great question this is my personal opinion, that us in the greater Boston area have to do a lot better at. I think we have to just be more in deeper relationship with Indigenous folks here, and we, you know, we're trying to do that. We folks at Neighbor to Neighbor and Green Roots have convened the Massachusetts Environmental Justice Legislative Table to push for environmental justice, which this is one thing that allies can do, is call your legislators, because we've made it pretty far this legislative session. And we're really, really hopeful that this year, after close to 2 decades of pushing for EJ legislation, that we can get environmental justice in the books. But, you know, working with the Native American and Indigenous Center of Boston, we're trying to make sure that the voices are at the table and that we are shaping the solutions together. But I do definitely think that that's an area that everybody in the greater Boston area can be doing a lot better. And when I think about Indigenous folks, I also think about our immigrant communities who come from Indigenous communities in countries like that come from Latin America and Central America, folks that are being displaced, that are also marginalized here in the US.
So one of the things that we do at IS is we work with the environmental, with the Indigenous Alliance Network, and we use the environmental justice principles in our work. And so one of the ways that that's important is that we don't encourage solutions that are market-based for like offsetting carbon, and we don't encourage solutions that will disproportionately impact the global south. We work on solutions that impact everybody in a beneficial way, or in the most beneficial way, closest to the communities that are being organized, thus those that are most impacted. And so while we are in alliances with organizations that center the needs of Indigenous people, don't do a lot of that work on the ground in Boston, but more in terms of national work. That's all I got to say about it. So
I guess I'll
get some buy-in from people who, from communities that are interested in having that conversation.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add that if folks want to get involved or know more, they should reach out to the North American Indian Center of Boston, NACOB.
Thank you so much for your answers. The next question is advice on how this person can start to incorporate environmental justice into their work if they do not work at an organization that is specifically focused on EJ work. Does anyone have any thoughts?
Environmental justice literally covers so much, and it does because the Black and brown communities have shortened lifespans because of environmental justice. And it really touches a lot of social justice issues. And so this is probably the best answer is a longer term or sort of long, what work are you doing kind of answer. But know that environmental justice work covers a lot of different issues, and that's why people who organize in environmental justice organize in a lot of related issues as well.
Great, thank you. Does anyone else have anything to add? Okay. Oh, Kalila, go ahead.
I mean, I guess just I have follow-up questions for this person that obviously I can't get answered, but I think, you know, the things that Maria Belen, so I'm not sure if they were thinking about specifically for their paid work or just generally in their life. I mean, I think the things that Maria Belen and Hajar have mentioned in terms of getting, you know, active are really important. And, you know, even if your organization doesn't focus on environmental justice, you can still be an environmental justice voter by, supporting the EJ bill and being, being in solidarity with movements. So figuring out what are some strategies to do that.
Thank you. The next question is actually kind of going along with that, but I guess like someone was wondering, to what extent is having a political voice a matter of having enough spare resources, such as time or money, to care, such as self-educate, petition, or protest about environmental justice, health, or other social justice issues?
Could you repeat the first part of that question? To what extent? Yeah.
To what extent is having a political voice a matter of having enough spare resources, such as time or money?
I mean, I think that's what it comes down to, right? Folks that live in low-income communities and folks that come from communities of color, the majority of folks don't have the time to go to a hearing at noon at the Energy Facility Siting Board that's located in South Station. It's not that they don't care or that they don't have any interest in it, but they are unable to. If they miss a job, that's less income for their family. That's less resources that they have to pay for the just necessities. And so I do think it's about resources, and I think that it is about the structural systems that have kept people oppressed for generations. And that's when allies can, in addition to changing the system and shifting the dynamics of power, that's when allies can come in. That's when allies have shown up for EJ and have spoken up to show that there is support for our communities. When our folks don't have a voice, that's when you ask, how can I help? And when there's a time and a place for you to speak on an issue that you've been asked to speak on, that's when decisions are made, and that's when you can influence a process. So I do think it's not as simple as that, because there's a whole system that has enabled it, but it is about folks that have the time, the resources, the money to be involved in the political process. And by political, I don't mean like political elections, but like in the system.
Thank you, Maria Belen. So the last question from the audience tonight is, how do we make underserved communities safer and healthier places to live without causing displacement through environmental gentrification? i.e., how do we keep these places affordable?
I could start. There's no perfect solution to that dynamic. I think, when you have a housing market that is, not built around principles of people having a right to housing, but, when you have a system that's housing for profit, the harm, the displacement is baked into it, and is impossible to divorce from that. This is, obviously, I'm sharing my opinion on that. However, I think that there's ways to reduce that harm, and I think those are the ways in which, and we're seeing those play out right now, across the country and our state. So one is, at a baseline level, like folks organizing through tenant organizations to fight back against displacement, and we are in partnership with a number of organizations that are doing that work on the ground, and they have been successful in getting the moratorium on evictions, particularly important during COVID. So that's definitely kind of a baseline, like level of defense. I think even pulling back and thinking about the planning and development processes that happen within our communities and within our regions, you know, how do you have ones where it is an explicit focus to maximize the amount of affordable housing, truly affordable housing, that's possible, you know, on a particular piece of land, and really strongly advocating for that. But I think it's also about how you think about public space, how you think about small businesses and all of the roles that those different sectors play in creating a community, because people want to live in a place, but, you know, in better times, we can leave our houses more freely, and really want to figure out how do you have a vibrant community, and what does that look like? So those are just some quick thoughts.
Thank you. Maria Belen?
Yeah, I'll just add that we've realized, like many EJ communities and EJ organizations across the country, that we can't do environmental justice without addressing land use and land policy and housing policy. And so that's critical, and it's key, like Kalila said, to do this work intersectional and to address housing when you are looking at improving quality of life and public health. We're seeing that in East Boston and Chelsea. The more beautiful and healthy a community becomes, the more expensive, and the very same people that have fought for that are not able to enjoy those benefits because they're being displaced. So you definitely have to look at housing policy and land use.
Thank you. Hajar, do you have anything to add?
Yes, I think I really believe that environmental justice has to look at all of those things, housing and reuse. But in a place like Roxbury, where there is no shortage of new development projects, as a matter of fact, within a mile radius, there's like 20 new projects. In a place like that, where the projects are high and placement is a so I could get on the box here, so I'm going to try not to. So there are systemic issues that include environmental justice that are directly connected with economic segregation and economic injustice, and also directly connected with displacement, with development, transit-oriented development, and all of these things are directly related to systemic racism and racial injustice. They are all connected with systemic public health issues. So when I speak to this, I am saying that when I say that these issues are very interconnected, I'm saying that these issues are not just interconnected in a theoretical way, but in an everyday lives. People live around and their parents dying early. I have a friend who's had a stroke 3 times. So when I say this to you, his oldest child is 53. So when I say this to you, I'm saying that it is a real on the ground issue. I have a friend who has a child who had asthma, and asthma attacks at 3 years old. Every summer I had to go to the emergency room with a 3-year-old for asthma attacks. This issue is not just displacement, and the displacement is real. The DPDA is building buildings that are for people who earn twice as much as the people in the neighborhood they're building the buildings in. That's how real. So displacement must. It's not might happen to some people. It's not that. It's a wave of people gone. That's displacement.
Thank you so much.
That displacement can't happen without systemic economic depression, systemic economic oppression, systemic small businesses that are living month to month and check to check. So COVID is not just simply impacting, so COVID is not a simple respiratory disease issue in a community like that. COVID is an economic explosion. COVID is a displacement explosion. So I talked to a public health official and she said, what are you doing about the housing crisis? What are you doing about the fact you're going to have a depression for the next 10 years? That is the difference in a low-income community and a community of color. So however you want to get involved, thank you for wanting to get involved. Thank you for wanting to be impactful, because anything you do would be helpful so long as you're listening to people and you're moving with them and not moving with whatever else. You got to move with them because they're the people living the issue and living the experience. So thank you. I didn't want to get on a soapbox, so I hope that wasn't too bad.
No, that was the perfect way to end this panel. Thank you so much to our panelists for taking the time to join us tonight. I'm going to pass it back to Gabriela to close.
Thank you, Neha. I'm just going to share my screen for one moment to give you some contact information for our hosts, the BU Student Government and the BUMC Climate Action Group. Thanks to both of them for partnering with BU Sustainability on this event. Thank you, Hajar, for those powerful closing words. This is not theoretical. This is affecting people's lives, their health and their lives, and it's life or death, and it's a real thing. It's not just a theory. So I'm really happy that you highlighted that and brought those words home for us. Thank you to all of our panelists, our attendees for asking questions, for being with us, to our moderators. I hope that you can connect with us. I'm going to stop this share because I want to launch a poll, a quick poll for you. We are planning on making this into a series that looks at different topics within EJ. As Hajar said earlier too, EJ covers so much. So this is just a beginning conversation, and I hope that it's a conversation we can keep having with our BU community, and we can keep finding ways to better integrate it into the work that we're doing in BU in lots of different areas. We're going to compile all the links and resources that were shared in the chat, and we're going to make those available with the recording of this session. And I hope that you'll join us for future sessions. Thank you to everyone for participating. Thank you for our panelists. And I hope that you take the next step and you get involved. Find an organization in your neighborhood, volunteer, think about EJ when you're voting, if you're able to vote. Look into these issues and think about not just globally, but locally, what it means in your community. And with that, I'm going to let you all go. Thank you for being here and have a wonderful, wonderful evening.